Alright, the second part of speech, pronouns. What are pronouns? We use them to replace nouns. So pronouns are used to replace nouns. Why do we do that? To basically avoid repetition. That is the function of pronouns. Now some important types of pronouns are personal pronouns. Personal pronouns obviously come from the word person, which means they refer to or they are used to replace specific individuals or individual. It could be singular or plural. So for example, I or he, she. In case of plural, it can be they or it. So basically they refer to specific individuals. And the opposite of these are called indefinite. Remember, they are called indefinite pronouns, not impersonal pronouns. So indefinite pronouns are not specific. They identify obviously objects, but they are not specific. So for example, each or every or all and so on. So these are indefinite pronouns. So they are not definite like personal pronouns, which are definite. They refer to specific individual or individuals. So these are the first two. Then we have something called demonstrative pronouns, and as the name suggests, they demonstrate, they show. So for example, this, that, these, those. These are demonstrative pronouns. They indicate, they point out, this and that are singular, these and those are plural, this and these show near objects, and that and those show further away objects. So these are demonstrative pronouns. Then we have interrogative pronouns. Again, as the name suggests, they interrogate, meaning they ask questions. Alright, so who or what and so on. So these are interrogative pronouns. Then we have something called relative pronouns, and they relate back to something previously spoken. So for example, the relative pronouns are who, which, that and so on. Now, one thing which is different about relative pronouns from other pronouns is that mostly the pronouns are used to replace nouns, as I've already mentioned. However, relative pronouns do not replace nouns, they relate back to a previous noun. So for example, if I say the boy who came first and so on, this is not used to replace boy, this is just used to relate back to it. That is why relative pronouns. Okay, so that takes care of pronouns for this particular chapter, parts of speech. So we are looking at everything in brief. We will be looking at these things in much greater detail, especially pronouns, because pronouns are very important for CAT and even for GMAT. So we will have a separate session exclusively for pronouns, in which we will look at them in a much greater detail. Alright, now we come to the next part of speech, verbs, which I think are the most important parts of speech, because you will figure this out as we move on. Now, a verb is something that denotes, is a word that denotes an action. So for example, he runs fast. So this is the action that he does. So they denote an action. However, verbs don't exclusively denote as in, it is not that verbs denote only actions. Verbs can denote something else also, and that is a state. So there is something called an action verb, okay, and there is something called a state verb. Now state verbs are also known as linking verbs. They are the same thing. So action verbs can be physical, or they can be mental. So don't confuse when someone says, I am thinking, don't confuse that thinking is a state verb because you can't see it. No, you don't have to see it. It is a mental action, but it is still an action. What state verb means is, suppose I say she is intelligent. Now this is a perfect sentence, there is no problem with it, and if it is a correct sentence, then you also know that it has to have a verb. Because every sentence has to have a verb, without which a sentence cannot exist. There are two things that a sentence needs to have at any given point in time, a subject and a verb. So obviously there is a verb here because this is a correct sentence and this is the verb. But if you think about it, it is not an action. Nothing is happening here. Then what is it doing? It is telling me about the state of this individual. Or you can look at it as that it is linking the subject with the predicate. So state verbs and linking verbs are the same thing. So what is a state? A state is that state to which a person or thing belongs at any given. This particular state is known as the state of being, which is represented by be verbs, and be verbs are verbs like is, am, are. So in this case, it is a state of being that is intelligent. Okay. Similarly, you can also say she likes ice cream. Again, this is not an action, it is just a state. The fact that she likes ice cream. So that is a state verb. You can also call them linking verb, as I told you, because they link the subject with the predicate. That brings me to the discussion of Alright, I've told you that a linking verb links the subject with the predicate. So obviously we need to discuss what is a subject and what is a predicate. A subject is, if the verb is an action verb, then a subject is the doer of the action. So in this case, he, because he is the one who is doing or who runs fast or is doing the running or whatever. So the doer of the action, in case of an action verb, is known as the subject. And if the verb is a linking or a state verb, then the subject is the main thing of the sentence, the thing we are focusing on or primarily talking about. So that is the subject of a sentence. And what is the predicate? A predicate is everything when you minus the subject and the verb from a sentence, then everything else is the predicate. So a linking verb links the subject with the predicate. There is some more stuff that we need to discuss about verbs, and that is, suppose I say he wants. Now, what is the obvious question that this verb demands? The obvious question is what? What is it that he wants? The answer, which means this verb cannot exist. It cannot exist without the answer to this question. In other words, this needs an object. And verbs which need an object, which cannot exist without them, are known as transitive verbs. In this case, let's say he wants, let's say, books. So books is the object of wants. However, if I say he is sleeping, does this verb require the answer to the question what? No. So it does not need an object. Such verbs which do not need an object are known as intransitive verbs. It is very easy to distinguish these two. Whenever you're confused about the definitions or between these, the best solution is forget about transitive verbs, just think of intransitive verbs and think of the fact that intransitive verbs begin with the word in, and in is a prefix. And it has two opposite meanings. One is in, so words like inside come from that meaning, and one is sort of opposite meaning, which is without or not, and that is words like incapable, so not capable and so on. This is that second meaning, without or not. Without or not what? Without or not an object. So that is the easiest way to remember the difference between these two. Just think of intransitive and think of the fact that intransitive is made up of in, so not, without, an object. So intransitive verbs do not need an object and transitive verbs need an object. They cannot exist without an object. There is one more thing I want to talk about verbs, which is that as we will do further sessions here, we will get into more advanced stuff, and then finally we will try tackling questions. We will do sentence correction the way grammar is asked in CAT and GMAT. This is perhaps the best thing that can happen to us. So what I'm saying is, when you're dealing with sentence correction, when you're trying to figure out an error or trying to correct something, identifying a verb or verbs, as many there are in a sentence, should be the first step, because that will help us probably the maximum, more than anything else in that sentence, to figure out what is going to happen or how do I correct this sentence and so on. So remember, verbs are probably the most important part of speech. So Alright, the next part of speech, adjectives. What are adjectives? Adjectives are things that modify, qualify, or tell me more about nouns and pronouns. Obviously, whenever I use the word nouns, it automatically implies pronouns as well, because pronouns are just replacements of nouns. So anyway, adjectives tell me about nouns and pronouns. They modify or qualify or explain them. So for example, I say she is beautiful. So this word is an adjective because it is qualifying she. It seems simple, but adjectives start creating an issue when you're supposed to figure out adjectives as well as adverbs in sentences, and then you tend to confuse these two. You tend to think which one is adverb and which one is adjective. So I'll tell you the best way of going about it. Because adjectives tell me about nouns and pronouns, you first figure out a noun or a pronoun or whatever nouns or pronouns in a sentence, and you ask them some questions, as in one of the few questions, and whatever answers that question will be a noun or will be an adjective. So one of the questions you can ask is what kind. So what kind is probably what you're asking this pronoun here, and this is what is answering that. Another question you can ask is how many. So for example, if you say he has 3 books. This is a noun, so you first have to figure this out. Then you ask this question, how many books? And the answer to this question will be the adjective. Another question you can ask is which one. So, for example, there are those people who don't like movies. This is the noun. You ask this question, which one or what kind or whatever, and then this is going to answer that question. So this will be the adjective in this case. So that is the best way of figuring out adjectives. You pick out the noun or the pronoun in a sentence and you ask one of these questions. Whatever answers that question will be the adjective. You've got to remember that the answer may not always be provided with a single word. The answer may be provided by a group of words. And so it could be a phrase or even a clause, which we will look at in greater detail in the next session. But anything which answers these questions individually as a single word or group of words will be the adjective.